Hello everyone, this is Jason Tondro and I'm a professor for World Lit and we are here for our final lecture, Milton's Paradise Lost. You're not reading the whole thing. You're reading only a small, relatively small section of it, probably no more than about a quarter of the entire book. Um, the the beginning of your book, the beginning of your section on Milton has a short introduction to Milton, his life, and in some of the themes of the poem. Read that. It's going to help orient you a little bit. Milton is writing at the end of what we think of as the English Renaissance in the late 1600s. He was widely recognized in his time as possibly the greatest writer in English that was alive at that time. He had been very politically active earlier in life. He was a very outspoken writer on politics and the evils of tyranny, that is, of a ruler who was not only absolute, not just that every word he said was law. That was not the issue. The issue was that those laws were unjust. Uh, and there was a parliament which was supposed to represent the people, and the king wasn't listening to the parliament. He wrote on topics like education, how to properly educate the people of England, and he wrote about journalism, about the press. He was very socially engaged. There were a series of what we now call the pamphlet wars, which were people sort of circulating these hand-printed essays on various topics that were important to the day, and people would pass these back and forth and hand them out on street corners and in London and so on. And they didn't have blogs back then, so this is basically what they had. You know, they had this sort of conversation going on between people, not verbally, but through these printed off pamphlets. And Milton was very important and influential in helping to shape public opinion and in articulating these very sophisticated arguments about what kind of a society we should have. You know, how should our society be organized and structured? Well, the politics of the time included a very difficult conflict between the King of England, who's Charles, and Parliament and the people. And there was a Puritan movement, a Protestant Reformationist religious movement that was arguing against what they saw as corruption in the government and in the church and in society, that society had gotten sort of loose and decadent, that it wasn't staying true to its Christian values anymore. And this Puritan movement got swept up in the political revolution, and a Puritan leader named Oliver Cromwell was briefly the ruler of the nation of England, and the king had to flee. He fled to France. And Milton, who had advocated for Cromwell and for the Puritans, was drafted into the government, and he briefly had a government role in Cromwell's government. Well, Cromwell's government didn't last. It lasted a few years, and when Cromwell was executed, and that interregnum period ended, Charles returned from France, and Milton, who had been on the wrong side of the political fight, like more than one of the authors we have read this semester, ended up essentially exiled. Not literally exiled. He wasn't literally kicked out of the country, but he was publicly and socially exiled. So he essentially retreated to his home, and his role as a public figure was over. But he still had a lot of ambition in terms of an artistic sense. Milton had intentionally trained himself to be a master of English writing. He had read all the guys we had read, except possibly for Beowulf, because he didn't know Beowulf existed. But he had read, for example, Dante, and he had read Plutarch, and he had written poems in Italian, in the Italian mode. He had read Shakespeare and Donne, and many people we have not read. And he wrote plays not very unlike Shakespeare's, although they were more court plays rather than common plays. They weren't plays to be performed by actors. They were plays to be performed by royal families. They were called masques. He wrote those. He wrote sonnets. He wrote short. He wrote long poems, which we would think of as shorter because they were shorter than Paradise Lost. They're poems which were very long, had epic themes, but he wanted to shoot for the biggest target. He wanted to create a poem, an epic, which was uniquely English, but which was as good or better than Virgil and Homer and all of those other great poets. He, much like we've talked about in previous classes with other writers, like we talked about how Ariosto wanted to out Virgil and so on. So it was with Milton. And he struggled to find the topic for his great epic poem. And he briefly considered writing it on knights and their adventures, sort of Arthurian romance. Well, he changed his mind, and it's a good thing he did, because his opinion of Arthurian romance and of the adventures of knights is not especially high. If you remember, the knights don't fare well in a lot of the literature that we've read. A lot of our writers think that they're all sort of ridiculous figures, or overly violent, or wasting their time. And Milton wanted to shoot higher and larger. And so he picked the biggest topic of all. Everything. Do you remember at the beginning of Dante's Inferno, when Dante is wandering lost in the woods, and Virgil finds him and leads him into the Inferno, and he says, "You've been chosen. We're going to show you the way the universe works. We're going to take you behind the curtain to all those things that man doesn't normally get to know. Like, how does God function? How does the universe built? How does all that stuff about, why are we here and how do things work?" And think back to Job, right? When Job was saying, why am I suffering so? And God shows up and says, look, there's a plan. I'm not going to tell it to you because you don't need to know it. What you need to do is trust me. There's a plan. And Dante says, well, here, let me show you what the plan is. And this is exactly the same motivation as Milton. Our selections from Paradise Lost, and as I say, we have only an edited version here in front of us. If you want to go with me in your book here, they start. Pages killing me. Here, page 774 is when it starts in our text, and there's a brief preamble where Milton talks about what he's going to do. The beginning of every book in Paradise Lost has this thing called the argument, which is very briefly a summary of the events of that book. There's 12 books in Paradise Lost. You're not reading all 12 of them. In fact, you only have one book in its entirety, and that's book 9. You have excerpts from about a half a dozen others, and then the rest of the book, you don't have it all. But I'm looking on page 775. What in me is dark, illumine. What is, lo, raise and support. That, to the height of this great argument, I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. He says, take everything that's dark in me and shine light on it. Everything that's low in me, lift it up, so that I can illuminate and explain to people, to my readers, you, why God does the things he does. I don't know if there's any bigger problem, any bigger question to try to answer. When Milton decided to pick a topic, he aimed as high as he could aim. Okay. Well, so very briefly, how does the book play out? Well, it starts off with the character of Satan. Like all great epics, it starts in the middle of the story. It starts with Satan falling, surrounded by fallen angels, and they're all falling this vast distance from heaven, as far as they can get from heaven, until they smash into this molten lake at the bottom of hell. And slowly they pick themselves up. They lie there, flat on their backs, for 9 days, during which, although we don't see it happen, God is off creating the world. And man, we don't see that happen here. Just 9 days pass in the line. And Satan and the other fallen angels pick themselves up, and they decide, well, what do we do now? Now that we've had our butts kicked all the way from heaven. So the whole war in heaven between Satan and God, and where the armies of heaven are split in half, and a bunch of angels side with Satan and a bunch of angels side with God, and there's this massive war that takes place. Well, that's already happened in the past. In fact, the creation of earth has already happened in the past, but we don't see it. Now, later in the book, we flash back. There comes a point where Adam is in the Garden of Eden. He hasn't done anything wrong yet. Adam's in the Garden of Eden, and one of the angels, Raphael, comes down, and Raphael and Adam eat together, and Adam says, I'm really curious. I'm a thinking guy. This is a very important quality, which you'll see throughout this poem, is that Milton's Adam is a thinker. He's always talking about reason and think and rationality. He's smart, and he's aware of the value of intelligence. This is to be contrasted with Eve, who's never described as reasonable. She's always described as things like sweet and tender and beautiful, never as smart or reasoning or in any way valuing intelligence. There's a misogynistic strain in Paradise Lost that many critics struggle with. Some people ignore it, some people defend it, some people say Milton's not a misogynist. It's very complicated, but what is true, I think it's hard to argue with this, is that when Milton talks about his protagonists, Adam and Eve, and what he admires about them, what he admires about Adam is that Adam has the power of reason. Eve is beautiful, both physically and in a spiritual sense. She is gentle and attractive in many other ways, but Adam does not love Eve for her brain. Okay. Anyway, Raphael and Adam are sitting there eating, and Adam begins asking questions about, well, how did the universe get to be this way? And Raphael, by this point, has said, well, there's this bad guy out there that's prowling around, and I'm not going to talk about him too much. And Adam says, well, how did he get there? How did he get in hell? And so then Raphael explains, he flashes back, and we get this whole story of the war in heaven, of the angels divided up into two armies, and how they battle and how they rage. And Satan's army is losing, and so he brings out his secret weapon. It turns out Satan has invented cannons, and he has these enormous cannons brought up, and they fire and kill a whole half an army of heaven's angels. before God sends Christ in with a sword to just, Christ being Christ, he can't be defeated, and 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 he sends Michael in, and Satan is defeated and he's kicked out. That whole story is described in flashback, and it's all cut from your version of Paradise Lost. If that all sounded cool, but we'll get to this later on, but the character of Satan is a very seductive one in this book. He's portrayed with a lot of the trappings of a romantic hero, of an epic hero. He's, at the beginning of the book at least, he's magnificent in his appearance. He's a giant. He's colossal. His body is fire. He's beautiful. He's heroic. He has an appearance of being heroic. They have this long debate. All the fallen angels get together and they have this long debate about what are we going to do. And Satan is saying, look, he has the great lines, many of which are cut from your version. He has great lines like, it's better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. His argument is that, I would rather be king of the tiniest little hovel, the worst possible home you can imagine, but be my own boss, than be a slave in the most beautiful home in the universe. Better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. When great dangers come up and all the rest of the devils and fallen angels are cowards, Satan volunteers. He has beautiful language. He has great speeches. The other demons, fallen angels, often seem to admire him, and they admire him for what seem to be kind of good reasons. All of this has led to many readers misreading Paradise Lost. It's a very common misreading, and I bring it up right away because many people see this as a poem in which Milton casts Satan as the good guy. In other words, Satan is sort of that classic Braveheart freedom character, that I will fight and die to the very last in order to obtain my freedom. And Satan talks about this a lot, and he casts God as this kind of evil, wicked tyrant, this ruler whose word is law. And if you want to see a Satan who's heroic, that's where you look. You look at these speeches where he calls God a tyrant. But that's not the hero of this book. Milton portrays Satan heroically because Satan wants to be seen heroically. He gives speeches that make himself look heroic, but his true motivation is never heroic, and that's always clear. If you read the book, it's right there where it's always clear that Satan always has other personal objectives in mind. He's doing this not because he wants to be free. He's not fighting God because he wants to be free. He's fighting God because he is too proud to not be number one. Satan cannot be ruled by anyone, even a perfect ruler, a guy who Satan will acknowledge in one of our later books, a part that we do have and that we will look at. He will acknowledge that Satan was a perfect ruler, and that that God is a perfect ruler. Satan will acknowledge that God is a perfect ruler, and that God gave him everything. God gave him his own existence. And all that God ever asked him to return was a simple thank you. But Satan, because he was so proud, was unable to give that thank you. And there's a point in the book where Satan understands that what he did was wrong, that his rebellion was wrong, but he can't help it because he's just so proud. And he desires to rule over others. People that bring up Satan as some kind of great champion of liberty and freedom neglect the fact that the only person free in Satan's version of the universe is Satan. Everybody else is subject to him. He would be the tyrant instead of God. That's the only offer Satan's making in this book. Well, your editors of this book, right now you're probably thinking, well, it sounds like they cut all the good parts. The editors of this book understand that this is the great misreading of Paradise Lost. That, like, literally for 100 years, that's what everybody thought this book was about. And they were all wrong. This is the great misreading, and even very important in people writing today. People like William Blake, who wrote in the late 1700s, he said that Milton was, quote, of the devil's part and didn't know it. That Milton didn't want to make Satan the hero, but he did such a good job that Satan's the hero anyway. The author of the book The Golden Compass, maybe you've read it or you've seen the film. It's a young adult series, fantasy series. That writer has argued that Milton's Satan is the chief inspiration for his book, that he sees Satan as a heroic figure, and that the point of those books is the point that he thinks Milton was trying to get at in this book. Well, he's wrong. But your editors understand that, and that's why they cut the book the way they did. The parts that got cut in your book, those parts are all the parts where Satan is most heroic. All the parts that would distract you from the real protagonist of the book, which is Adam, have been cut. And the parts that preserve Adam's story the most are the parts that are still in. So this is good for you. I mean, it's always a shame to read a book that's been cut. And I won't say that you're better off reading 1/4 of Paradise Lost than the whole thing. But I will say that there's a reason why your book is cut the way it is. And it's not a bad reason, and it might even be a little wise in terms of a first reader. If you didn't have anybody here to walk you through this book, it would be better that you were reading it maybe the way that you were reading it the first time. But you're not really reading Paradise Lost. You're just reading, you're getting a taste of it. Sir Francis Bacon, a great philosopher and writer and thinker, one of those people that later scholars have wondered might actually have written Shakespeare's plays. That's complete. We dealt with that last lecture, but Francis Bacon, he wrote voluminously, and he'd read everything in English, and he wrote, some books are to be tasted, some books are to be swallowed, others are to be chewed and devoured. Well, any one of you that's had to study for a test at the last minute, you all know exactly what he's talking about. Sometimes you just don't have time to read the whole book. You have to just skim it. And then if it deserves it, you just take the whole thing in. You don't even question it. You just take it all in. But only the best books deserve to be taken apart a little bit at a time, to be chewed up slowly and slowly devoured. Well, Paradise Lost is one of those books. But tonight, we're just going to taste it. Okay. The poem can be, for our purposes, the poem can be broadly divided into a few sections. First, you've got the initial section with Satan in hell, figuring out what he's going to do. Then he travels to Earth. He spies Adam and Eve. We get some conversation with Adam and Raphael. Then we have the seduction, in which Satan takes on the body of the serpent, and he seduces Eve to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then we have the fallout from that, in which, for our book, Satan disappears, and it's all about Adam and Eve and what do they do, and how does God respond and react to what they do. So we'll sort of walk this through a little bit at a time. Okay, so let's take a very brief pause. We'll come back and we'll start right off with Satan and the other demons, fallen angels in hell. Okay, in the first two books of Paradise Lost, Satan and all the other fallen angels wake up in hell, and they walk around for a little while, kind of getting their bearings straight, and then they create a magnificent city called Pandemonium, which in Greek literally means a city of all demons. They create this magnificent city in hell, which is a satire of St. Paul's Cathedral, by the way, in London. And then they go there for a sort of great debate about what are they going to do. And this is eventually resolved in the idea that, well, God has apparently he's created a whole nother planet. He's created this world. And there might even be some things on it like that are alive. So let's go there and find out what he's done, and then we'll find out a way to ruin it. We'll find out a way to ruin it in revenge. And Satan volunteers to be the person who will do all of this because it's very dangerous. That's the 2-minute version of what happens in the first 2 books of Paradise Lost. At the beginning of each book, you have these long arguments. They're summaries of all the events of the book. Read them. They're very useful to you. They're written by Milton. The first time he put out the poem, it was pretty hard to read. A lot of people weren't quite sure what to make of this poem when it first came out. And one of his editors said, look, can you give us a little sort of Cliff Notes version at the beginning of each chapter, just sort of tell us what happens? And Milton said, sure. So he writes these arguments, and they are summaries of the plot of that book. Read them, because that will allow you to focus less on what's happening, because you'll have a Crib Notes version, and instead you can focus on the language and how people are saying it, and what are the poetic aspects of the book. That is, how are his metaphors working? What are his themes? What's he saying, and what's he doing other than the plot? Satan and the fallen angels lie on their backs in the molten lake of hell for 9 days. When they rise, they are still, in many ways, angels. Milton spent a lot of time in this book thinking about what we would today call metaphysical issues. Things like, what are angels made of? Do angels need to eat? What is it like to be an angel? What are they? And how are they different than human beings? And he later on, in our section, you'll find all the times Adam asks questions like, well, so, do angels have sex? And Raphael answers him and tells him, well, sort of. He says we're beings of pure fire. Our bodies are basically pure fire. And so we don't have physical sex because we don't lust. Lust is wicked. We don't have any wickedness. We don't have lust. Instead, our bodies just sort of merge together, like our flaming bodies just become one, and that's our version of sex. Anyway, there you go, angel sex, things you didn't know, but now you've read Paradise Lost. Well, this is important to us because the character of Satan, he starts off as this kind of angelic figure, and his body is burning fire, and he's a colossal giant, and he's radiant and beautiful and awesome. This is not the Satan that you saw, for example, at the bottom of the Inferno, who's this sort of vicious, ugly, bat-winged thing with like 3 heads and 6 wings and covered in hair. This is a magnificent Satan who 9 days ago was the most beautiful angel in heaven. And yeah, he's fallen from that great height, but he's still pretty gorgeous. But as the book goes on, Satan is a changer of shapes. He can change his appearance. And as the book goes on, he keeps changing his appearance a little bit by a little bit. And every time he does that, he's a little bit less glorious. He takes one step farther down, farther down, farther down. So, for example, he's an angel. Right now, he's not just any angel. He's an archangel. He's the greatest of all angels. Well, by book 4, he's found Eden, and he wants to sneak into it. So he adopts the appearance of an angel so that he can move amongst the other angels who are on guard duty. We have an angel named Uriel who's on guard duty at Eden. And so Satan adopts the form of this angel. Well, he's an angel, and he's indistinguishable from the other angels, and Uriel falls for the disguise. But Satan is no longer this great being that he was. Now he's just an angel, if you'll accept my little air quotes there. And then later on, he when he sees Adam and Eve and he wants to get closer to them, he inhabits the body. He takes on the body of a lion, which is king of the beasts, right? Top of the animal food chain. But then just as quickly, like a one line later, he changes to get closer. He changes into a tiger. Still pretty impressive, but not a lion, right? And then he adopts the body of a mist, like a smoke. And then, only then, does he go into the body of the serpent, which he inhabits and takes over. He possesses the body of the serpent. And at that time, the serpent is still beautiful. Its scales are gorgeous, and it's got the magnificent hood, and it rises up, and it tries to show itself off for Eve, and it's beautiful and seductive. But by the end of the book, the serpent has been punished by God, and it's now weak and pathetic enough that Eve can crush it with her heel, right? This is the great prophecy that God gives when Adam and Eve and Satan are all punished for their involvement in the fall. Well, what are you seeing here? You're seeing a Satan that physically falls in terms of his body. He becomes a lower form of creature, step by step by step, through the book. In order for that to work, for that contrast to work, he's got to be as magnificent as possible at the beginning and as pathetic and miserable as possible at the end. So it starts off with him magnificent. Nine times the space that measures day and night to mortal men, he with his horrid crew lay vanquished, rolling in the fiery gulf, confounded though immortal. But his doom reserved him to more wrath, for now the thought both of lost happiness and lasting pain torments him. Round he throws his baleful eyes that witnessed huge affliction and dismay mixed with obdurate pride and steadfast hate. At once, as far as angels can, he views the dismal situation, waste and wild. A dungeon, horrible, on all sides round as one great furnace flamed. Yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible, served only to discover sights of woe, regions of sorrow, doleful shades, where peace and rest can never dwell. Hope never comes that comes to all, but torture without end still urges, in a fiery deluge, fed with over-burning sulfur unconsumed. Such place eternal justice had prepared for those rebellious. Here, their prison ordained in utter darkness, and their portion set as far removed from God and light of heaven as from the center thrice to the utmost pole. Satan looks up in hell, and he looks around and he sees hell for the first time. And he sees this awful dungeon, this place that has that wonderful phrase of Milton's, darkness visible. This is a trope of Milton's, not darkness visible specifically, but this idea of contrasting sort of mutually exclusive adjectives. Darkness, but it's so dark that it's actually seeable, that you can actually see the darkness. It's so dark, right? It's impossible, but it's amazing. This is the hell that Satan is in. And hell is made worse because he can still remember how wonderful heaven was. We'll come back to this question of Satan and hell soon. There are a number of other fallen angels that have fallen with Satan. His whole army, in fact, but there's a group of leaders, and they all have names. People like Beelzebub and Moloch and Belial and so on. And these guys all sort of pick themselves up, and they move. They move to this city that they create, sort of instantly with magic. They create this city for themselves called Pandemonium. That part, the creation of Pandemonium, is actually skipped in your book. When they go into this city then and they begin to debate, well, okay, what are we going to do now? And each of the princes of hell, each of the various leaders, all have sort of their own personal view on the matter. But it's important for us to remember that ultimately none of that matters. Satan is a tyrant. Satan accuses God of being a tyrant, but Satan is, in fact, himself a tyrant. Everybody else voices their opinions, but ultimately the only opinion that matters is what Satan decides to do. He doesn't necessarily force the other fallen angels to do what he says, because they're all cowards, so they do it anyway. They're sort of like sheep, you know. They go where the shepherd sends them, and so they talk a big game. The fallen angels, Beelzebub and all those guys, Belial and Moloch, they talk a big game about what are they going to do. But ultimately, they're going to do whatever Satan does, because he's the only one with any guts. And even that is only because he requires that they admire him. He does what he does not because it's right, noble, just, and true, or even because it's brave. He does it because it gets him the applause. Right? He does it for the crowd. Well, their debate takes on various forms. So the first devil to speak is Moloch. His speech starts on 782, and he says, "I want to go right back to war." Moloch, sceptered king, stood up, the strongest and the fiercest spirit that fought in heaven, now fiercer by despair. His trust was with the eternal, to be deemed equal in strength. He had thought that he was equal to God in power. And rather than be less, cared not to be at all. Moloch would rather than be second best, he would rather not exist at all. To be or not to be, right? He would rather be destroyed. He'd rather be dead than be number two. With that care lost went all his fear of God or hell, or worse he recked not, and these words thereafter spake, "My sentence is for open war." Moloch says, we should just go right back in there fighting. We should just all fly right back up, go all the way back to heaven, and just pick up right where we left off. Why does Moloch say this? Not because of any noble reason, but because he wants God to destroy him. He wants to be dead. Okay. Second speaker starts on 73. This is Belial. Belial says, "Oh, you're so right, Moloch. We really should go do that. But, you know, if God's that bad, if God hates us, this is, you have to think like a fallen angel for a minute. If God hates us, he's not going to give us what we want. In fact, that's God's first choice, is to not give us what we want. Well, all we want is to be free. He won't give us that. Well, so what makes you think that he's going to give you what you want? If what you want is to be destroyed, well, that's the one thing God's never going to do. He's going to make you live. And you're never going to get what you want. Whatever you want, God's not going to give you. So he said, we should just stay here. You know, he says, look, hell's not so bad. Okay, it's bad, but it could be worse. And he talks about the flaming tempests, and he talks about the burning rivers, and he starts describing all the landscape that you read in Dante. He says, you know what, hey, maybe we could make it beautiful. You know, maybe we could make it not so bad. Let's just stay here. Let's just let it go. It's over. Why is Belial saying this? Is he saying it because he really wants peace? Well, the answer is right there for you on 786. Thus Belial, with words clothed in reason's garb, words that sounded reasonable, counseled ignoble ease and peaceful sloth. Not peace. Belial doesn't want peace. He's just lazy. He just doesn't want to. Just doesn't want to go through the effort of doing all that war stuff again. He's just lazy. He wants to take it easy. That's why all these guys, their speeches sound heroic. Oh, back to war. Self-destruction. Peace. Laziness. They always sound gorgeous. But that's the point. That's what a good speaker does, right? He makes himself look good. That's what you're getting here. They debate more. One guy says we should find a way to trick God. We should win by stealth, by trickery, rather than by force of arms, because we've proven that we don't have the force of arms. We aren't physically powerful enough to win, right? So let's not try to do that. Let's be sneaky instead. And this is when Beelzebub sets up Lucifer. Beelzebub's job is basically to make Satan look good. He's sort of like Satan's right-hand man. But Satan doesn't really allow anybody to take any power away. So Beelzebub's job is really just to be like the toady, to be like the sidekick guy who's just there to make Satan look good. And Beelzebub says, well, we've heard about this mysterious new world out there. What do you think we should do, Satan? And Satan, this plan is put forward. Beelzebub actually puts forward the plan. He says, look, somebody should go to this place and find out what's there, and then ruin it somehow, just to spite God, just to put a thumb in his eye, just to make him waste his work. We know that he spent 6 days working on this thing. Well, let's make him have wasted his time. But whoever goes off to do this, it's going to be really dangerous, because hell is separated from earth by chaos, by this sort of eternal storm. And it's terrifying. So whoever has to go to this place is going to have to go through chaos, and it's going to be awful. Well, who is going to volunteer for that? And Beelzebub sets it up as being the most heroic feat that could ever be accomplished. And all of the fallen angels, they're all cowards, right? They're all self-serving cowards. They all refuse to go. They don't volunteer. But Satan volunteers, as Beelzebub knew he would. And he says, well, I'll go. I'll go. I'll take this difficult task upon me. Remember, speeches always sound good, right? And Satan says, I'll do it. And it sounds like he's doing it for heroic reasons, but he's really doing it because, A, he's just got to get out of here. Hell is the worst. Hell is the worst place imaginable. And he would want to be anywhere other than here. And if he can get out of here, it's totally self-serving. It's totally selfish on his part. Secondly, if he volunteers, all the fallen angels will adore him. And he really needs that. He's very proud. He needs the applause of the crowd. So, he agrees to this idea and flies out from hell. Now, there's a large section of the book that has been cut. Satan travels to the edge of hell, and there's gates at hell. And the gates are guarded by a monster named Sin. It's a female. It's a she. And she has a fellow guard. There's another creature guarding the gates, and that is a creature called Death. And when Satan encounters them, he doesn't know what they are at first. But then he recognizes them because they recognize him, and we come to understand that Sin is his own daughter. Is his daughter, who's this sort of monstrous, horrifying she creature. And Death is the son that he had with Sin, his own incestuous son / grandson. And sin and death guard the gates of hell. And they let Satan through. And he travels across the storm of chaos until he finally sees Earth hanging like a jewel from a chain. It's this beautiful, far-off place. And he flies towards it and finally reaches it. And he adopts the form of an angel to be in disguise amongst the other angels who are guarding Earth. All that stuff's cut. Let's pause real briefly and then we'll come back and we'll pick up in Eden, okay? All right, we're back and we're picking up in Eden now. Our scene has changed. We're going to start off with Satan and then we'll move on to a conversation between Raphael and Adam, and we learn about the creation of Adam and Eve. And we'll move all through Adam and Eve's conversation in the garden when they separate, and we'll stop before we get to chapter 9, book 9, which is the great actual fall itself, the seduction and the fall. This beginning part of book 4 is very important to us because it allows us to see Satan honestly. Remember what we were talking about in the Shakespeare, how you get these moments where Hamlet steps up and he's on the stage all alone and there's nobody else around, and that means he has nobody to lie to. There's nobody around for him to play to. He has no audience. It's just him. And so he can be honest for a change, right? We get this with Satan. Now that he's away from all the other demons, the other fallen angels, and there's no one else around. Presumably God's watching, but Satan conveniently forgets that. Let's look at some of that speech. It's on 793. Horror and doubt distract his troubled thoughts, and from the bottom stir the hell within him. For within him hell he brings, and round about him. Nor from hell one step no more than from himself can fly by change of place. This is a very interesting phrase, and it comes back again on the next page when we get the line, which way I fly is hell, myself am hell. One of the reasons Satan agrees to leave hell is because he can't handle it there. It's so awful. But as he leaves and he arrives in Eden, what he comes to understand is that the awfulness that he's trying to escape is in here. His guilt, his shame, his conscience, he knows that what he did is awful, and he can't escape it. It's a greatly exaggerated form of Claudius trying to pray in that scene in Hamlet when he says, bend stubborn knees, you are in the wrong. But Claudius tries to repent and it doesn't work. He says, I'm not really repenting. I'm not really sorry because I'm keeping everything that I got by killing my brother. I'm keeping my crown and I'm keeping Gertrude and I still have my ambition. In a similar way, Satan understands that what he did was wrong, but he can't give up. He can't change. And so it doesn't matter how far he travels. It doesn't matter how far he puts hell, the physical hell, behind him, because the truth of what he's done will never leave him. So he's always in hell. He brings hell with him. And that's what this is getting at. Now conscience wakes despair that slumbered, wakes the bitter memory of what he was, what is, and what must be worse. He's remembering what he was as an angel in heaven, and then what he is now, and what he's going to have to do and become later in the future. He knows that he's on a downward slide. It's only going to get worse from here. Let's skip a little bit and look a little bit farther down around line 35. He's calling out to God. To thee I call, but with no friendly voice, and add thy name, O Son, to tell thee how I hate thy beams. The sun, he hates this, calls out, and you too, you son, I hate you too. Why? That bring to my remembrance from what state I fell. how glorious once above thy sphere, above the sun, till pride and worse ambition threw me down, warring in heaven against heaven's matchless king. Ah, wherefore? When someone says wherefore, they mean why. Why? Why did I fight heaven's matchless king? He deserved no such return from me, whom he created what I was in that bright eminence. God made me. What he didn't deserve my rebellion. And with his good upbraided none. He never punished or said a hard word to me. Serving him was not hard. Serving him was good. It was pleasurable. Nor was his service hard. What could be less than to afford him praise? The easiest recompense, and pay him thanks how due. God wants us to praise him. Well, doesn't he deserve it? And he asks us to thank him. Shouldn't I? Yet all his good proved ill in me, and wrought but malice. Lifted up so high, I disdained subjection. I was so high up that I thought I should be second to none. And thought one step higher would set me highest. And in a moment quit the debt immense of endless gratitude, so burdensome, still paying, still to owe, forgetful from what from him I still received, and understanding not that a grateful mind by owing owes not but still pays, at once indebted and discharged. What burden then? He compares the creation of him by God to a debt, like a bill, a physical debt, like a rental payment, right? Like you own a house. And he says, and I owed this bill, and I thought that I could dodge the bill forever if I could get rid of the landlord. But that debt is one of immense gratitude. And I had forgotten what I am still receiving. Don't I still continue to exist? I still have the debt. As long as I exist, I will owe God for that existence. You can't quit that unless you're dead. Now, this idea, by the way, of your life as a debt, as a bill that you're going to have to eventually come back and pay, has shown up in a couple of the other things that we have read, and it's a theme in poetry throughout the medieval and Renaissance period, and later. And some really beautiful and sometimes even very funny poems have been written about it, about this idea that God shows up like a bill collector, and you keep trying to dodge it, but the bill's always, eventually it's got to be paid, and no matter how much you dodge, he's going to catch up to you. This speech is important because whenever someone misreads Paradise Lost and they believe that Satan is this kind of heroic figure fighting against a tyrant who's ordering him around, you need to look at this moment where Satan is honestly acknowledging that he was in the wrong, that he was motivated by pride and a desire to be top, not a motivation for freedom. It's not like Satan's going to suddenly make all the other fallen angels free. The only person free in Satan's universe is Satan. And he's in deep despair over what he's done. And this is not insignificant because Satan is still at a point where, and this is actually specifically noted in one of the earlier books, I think it's in book 2, that because the fallen angels are so close from heaven, they haven't fallen all that long ago, they can still do good. There are still parts of them that are good. They are not wholly evil and corrupted yet. They can still do the occasional good thing. And Satan's acknowledgement that what he did was wrong is maybe an aspect of that. He's not completely bad yet. He's good enough to understand that he's not good. Does that make sense? He can see his own failure. failure, and it deeply, deeply depresses him at a profound bodily level. Which way I fly is hell. Myself am hell. Okay. And at the end of this speech, he basically disavows all good. He says, you know what? He says, if this is the me I'm going to have, then let's just go all in. You know, he says, all good to me is lost. Evil, be thou my good. You know, I'll hold up evil as my good. And this happens before he sets off on his great quest he decides to corrupt Adam and Eve. All right. Well, anyway. We move on, and we get a description of Adam's creation. We talked a little bit about the differences between Adam and Eve in this book, and I think it's important for us to think about the way that they relate to each other and the way that they relate to God. Milton's vision is what we would call a chain of being. It's a ladder, and everything in the universe, it fits on that ladder. Everything is subject to someone, and everything is subject over someone else, except for God, who's on the very top, right? God's on the top. But everybody else has something above them and something below them. Okay. Adam is answerable to God. But Eve is answerable to Adam. That's the chain. It goes God, Adam, Eve. Eve does not talk to God. Adam talks to God, and then Eve talks to Adam. You have a footnote in your book. It's on page 799. 1 Corinthians 11:3. The head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man. This vision of a family household where the man is in charge and the woman is obedient. I don't think we can escape that that's Milton's conception of an ideal family life. This idea that the husband and wife should be equal, that they should make decisions together, for example, or that the woman might have authority at times. That's a concept that Milton does not portray in his conception of the ideal family, Adam and Eve. Accusations of misogyny are pretty common when you're talking about Milton. It's not made any worse by the fact that his wife left him after 6 weeks. How does he describe these people? Look on 799. Adam and Eve, man and woman. Adam first. For contemplation, he, and valor formed. Adam was made for contemplation, for thought. This is a scholarly Adam. Adam was made for contemplation and for valor, for bravery, for fighting. Not just fighting, but fighting for the right reason. Valor. She, Eve, for softness she, and sweet attractive grace. He, for God only. She, for God in him, small h. Now, Milton would defend this by saying, look, everybody serves. Man serves, woman serves, we all serve. It's just that Adam serves God and Eve serves Adam. Well, it was the 1600s. It was the 17th century. And I think before we dismiss him, I don't want to ignore the misogyny, but I also don't want to dismiss the whole book just because it's not feminist, because it doesn't have a strong leading female character. It's important to see where the book is coming from in terms of its historical context and the sources that inform it, because Milton doesn't just make this up, you know. He's got a biblical reference for it. it's right there in the New Testament. I mean, this idea that man runs the house and the woman supports the man, it's Milton's got a citation, he has a background for it. So if you accuse him of misogyny, you have to accuse Paul of misogyny because he's the one that wrote Corinthians. And you can make that argument, but then your beef isn't with Milton, it's with somebody else. Okay. You will see this theme, though, over and over again, this idea that Eve should be subjected to Adam, that she is lesser in terms of authority than him. It's a deep-rooted observation that men and women are different, and any attempt to make them the same is sort of a fool's game. This is the argument. I'm not saying I believe this, okay? I'm trying to present what our author is getting at. That men and women are different, and we shouldn't try to say that men and women are the same, and their experiences are different, and their lives are different, and therefore their role in God's cosmos is different. They have different jobs, and they do their things in different ways. He, for contemplation and valor, thoughtfulness and bravery. She, softness and sweet, attractive grace. Now, you may not like that idea, all of the women in my audience, that women aren't allowed. Women who are thoughtful and valorous are taking occupations designed for men. And men who are soft and filled with sweet, attractive grace are not being sufficiently manly. They're being feminized. Well, this is Milton's view of men and women and how we were made. Okay. One thing that you will notice, think back to Dante. We asked ourselves, why do people who sin go to hell instead of purgatory? The answer was that the people that go to hell refuse to acknowledge they did anything wrong. They always blame somebody else for their sin. Oh, it was that sin of that guy, or it was that book I was reading, or somebody else made me sin, and that's why I'm here. And they never acknowledge that what they did was wrong. Sometimes they even blame God. You'll see that here. You'll see Lucifer. You'll see Satan blame God. Milton knew Dante very, very well. I mean, in terms of he read the Divine Comedy. He didn't know him personally because they lived hundreds of years apart. But he had read the Divine Comedy. And a lot of the themes are very similar, and they draw on Paradise Lost draws on Dante and builds on Dante, and that's why you guys are the perfect audience for this book. Eve's vanity comes back again and again. You read the story about how Eve was first created. She's, Adam names all the animals, and all the animals bow to him. Then that chain of being, all those animals, everybody is underneath Adam. There's God and there's Adam. And then there's everything else. And he's like, well, every horse has his mare and every goose has his gander, but where's my mate? And he sort of gets into a little debate with God, and he defends his need for a mate. And God says, oh, you're so smart. I love it when you're smart. God's like, I knew you were going to say that. And I, of course, I've already got Eve ready. I've already got a mate ready for you. But I'm so glad to hear you articulate all of these reasons. Adam's intelligence is part of the reason God loves him. It's part of the reason why God admires man. All right, so he falls asleep and the rib is taken out. There's this great sort of little narrative scene where we get to Adam falls asleep, and in a dream, he dreams he's sort of out of his body experience, and he sees the hand open up his own side, and the rib is taken out, and then the rib is made into Eve. Meanwhile, Eve wakes up, and the first thing she sees is her own image. She looks in the river, and she sees her own face, and she goes, oh, I don't know what that is, but man, is it beautiful. and she falls in love with her own image. It's a reference to Narcissus, one of the old Greek myths in Ovid, which Milton knew well. She falls in love with her own image, and she would continue to do that if God doesn't say that. Don't fall in love with that. That's you. You're looking at you. Don't do that. And he leads her away to Adam. But when she sees Adam, she thinks, oh, he's so ugly. He's hideous. She runs, and Adam has to chase her. And it's about Milton's trying to make some sort of observation about what women are like from the very beginning. He describes them as vain and that they have to be chaste. Milton was married 3 times. All right. There's a long conversation between Adam and Raphael. We only look at a part of it. It's in book 8. We've skipped whole books here. We skipped that whole war in heaven part between Satan and the other angels and all the cannons and God's thunderbolt and Christ. Because Christ is a character and God is a character in Paradise Lost, and they have lines and they talk to one another. All of that stuff has been cut. The great accusation against God in this book is that God's really boring in Paradise Lost, because all the great lines go to Satan, and God's boring because he's perfect. He knows everything. He can't really be defeated. To fight God is a stupid quest because God's God and you can't ever defeat him. And so people, the angels fight, and finally God's like, oh, well, I guess you better go in there and finish this off. And he sends Jesus in, and Christ breaks the fallen angels' army, and it's all over. But there's a whole debate in there in heaven where Christ is saying, look, what are you going to do with all this? I mean, look at Satan. He's rebelling. Lucifer, he's gone to the dark side. What are you going to do? And God's like, there's a plan. It all makes sense. You got to, and he explains it all. But we don't have that part. Interestingly, we've been talking about Adam's reason. Adam was made for contemplation, and his skills at debate and his intellectual prowess is something that God values and reason and treasures. But in this conversation with Raphael, it comes up. Adam starts to ask all these questions. He asks questions about the cosmos and the stars, and he asks, how do the planets move, and how do stars work, and all of these questions about the cosmos, about the greater galaxy. And Raphael says, you don't need to know all that stuff. He says there are things that you don't need to know. Solicit not thy thoughts with matters hid. Leave them to God above. Him serve and fear. Of other creatures, as him pleases best, wherever placed, let him dispose. You ask if there are people living on other planets. Well, if there are, let him take care of them. It's not your business. You can't affect them anyway. Heaven is for thee too high to know what passes there. Be lowly wise. Think only what concerns thee and thy being. Dream not of other worlds, what creatures there live, in what state, condition, or degree, contented that thus far hath been revealed not of earth only, but of highest heaven. And Adam says, okay. You get this. We often have this idea that that God gives Adam and Eve one command: just don't eat of this tree. But there's other things in this book that Raphael tells Adam not to do. He says, look, it's good to be smart, but there are some things that you shouldn't inquire about. Think about our world today, how much we know about. We have this moment, as we speak, we have a machine about the size of an SUV on the surface of the planet Mars. And it's trucking around there like a remote control car. And it's digging up things in the ground looking for microbes and germs. And it's called Curiosity for any of you that don't know what I'm talking about. Dream not of other worlds, in what creatures there live, in what state, condition, or degree. Part of Milton's argument, and it's a tough nut to swallow, is that there are some things man should not ask. There are some questions we don't get to know the answer to. We shouldn't ask. Be lowly wise. Worry about what's around you. And there's a certain appeal. We can understand that argument. Like this is the argument of people who say, well, we got people starving in America. Why are we sending spaceships to the moon? You're right. There are people starving in America. But the little spaceship we send to the moon isn't going to feed them. But Milton's argument is that argument that, look, we should just worry about the day-to-day living stuff. Don't think too high. I think that's the reason why a lot of people resent God when they read this book. Because there's a certain know-nothingness, a certain argument that, well, it's good to be smart, but don't be too smart. And that can rub a lot of people wrong. Our society is not one that deals real well with limits. We tend to see all limits as just the next thing to be overcome. I'm looking through the rest of this book to see if there's anything else we need to touch on. A lot of things that we've already mentioned. Eve's vanity, the way that she is beautiful, in a sense of almost too beautiful, like she's been kind of made too pretty for her own good. That's also here. That conversation that we mentioned earlier about angels having sex, that's here on 813. Raphael's talking about this issue of sex and love. And remember, Milton's first object at the beginning of this book was to explain the ways of God to man. Why do we have sex? Why does sex even exist? What's the difference between sex and love? Why do we lust? Right? Is lust bad? If it doesn't hurt anybody, if it just feels good, why is it bad? I'm on 813. In loving, thou dost well. In passion, not. Wherein true love consists not. That passion is not love. And to be passionate, to desire, to have physical desire for someone is not love. And we should not conflict those two. In fact, passion is bad. Love is good. Passion is bad. And this is why he says, angels, we don't even have sex. We just have this sort of merging of bodies that's pure. All right, so let's pause very briefly and we'll come back and talk about book 9, which is the actual fall when Satan tempts Eve and then Eve and Adam eat of the fruit and all that business. We'll pause and then come back. Okay, we're here for our finish off our conversation about Paradise Lost. We're going to start off with book 9 and then sort of skim through the very brief bits after the book is finished. Book 9 begins with a very important note from Milton. This is the sort of central chapter of the book, not physically because it's 12 books long and 9 comes 3/4 in, but it's central because this is where the actual fall, this is where paradise is actually lost, right? Is here in this chapter. And so before he begins the chapter, he speaks to us directly and he defends his choice of topic. This is important because he's talking about all the books we've already read. No more of talk where God or angel guessed with man. as with his friend, familiar used to sit indulgent, and with him partake rural repast, permitting him the while venial discourse unblamed. He says, we're not going to have any more conversation about God and angels and Adam just sitting around having tea. Okay? That was a beautiful time period when we could do that, but that's all gone now. I now must change these notes to tragic. Foul distrust and breach disloyal on the part of man, revolt and disobedience on the part of heaven, now alienated, distance and distaste, anger and just rebuke and judgment given, that brought into this world a world of woe, sin, intershadow death, and misery, death's harbinger. Sad task, yet argument not less, but more heroic than the wrath of stern Achilles on his foe pursued, thrice fugitive about Troy's wall, or rage of Turnus for Lavinia disespoused, or Neptune's ire, or Juno's, that so long perplexed the Greek and Cytherea's son. If answerable style I can obtain of my celestial patroness, who deigns her nightly visitation unimplored, and dictates to me slumbering, or inspires easy my unpremeditated verse, since first this subject for heroic song pleased me, long choosing and beginning late, not sedulous by nature to indite war, hitherto the only argument heroic deemed, chief mastery to dissect with long and tedious havoc fabled knights in battles famed, the better fortitude of patience and heroic martyrdom unsung, or to describe races and games, or tilting furniture, emblazoned shields, impresses quaint comparisons and steeds, bases and tinsel trappings, gorgeous knights at joust and tournament. Then marshalled feast served up in hall with sewers and seneschals. The skill of artifice or office mean, not that which justly gives heroic name to person or to poem. Okay, that was all one sentence. I know. That was all one sentence. What is he getting at? Okay, so first, he says, okay, so we're not going to talk about that beautiful time anymore. We're going to have to talk about this time when all these awful things happen, right? But the topic is heroic. It's no less heroic than Achilles when he was chasing Hector around the city of Troy. It's no less heroic than when Aeneas was fighting Turnus for the hand of Lavinia. It's no less heroic than when Odysseus was in his adventures trying to escape and return home. He takes a brief moment out there, 6 or 8 lines, to talk about how he composes. Milton claims that this poem comes to him in his sleep, that these lines come to him either when he's asleep or when he naps, like in the afternoon. He says that he writes, of course, okay, we have to step back a little bit here. Milton was blind by the time he wrote this poem. He'd been going slowly blind over his middle years, and by the time that he composed this poem, he was completely blind. He composed the lines, and they were written down by his daughters. He says that he preferred to do this in the hours just after sunset, like in the early hours of the evening. And the words would just come to him. They would just come to him, and he would just speak them, and they would be written down, like he was taking dictation from God or something. Although he doesn't say that. He claims a sort of divine source, but not God. He says, until now, the only topic that was considered worthy of an epic was war. But war's not a good topic, he says. It's long and tedious. It's battles that don't really mean anything. It's filled with ornamentation, lots of people worrying about things that don't matter. Think about all of those sections of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, where you got page of descriptions of the hunt, or the way that Gawain put on his armor, or the way that a person looked. Think about Landval and all those lines spent on the clothing that Landval's fairy princess is wearing. Milton says, what the fuck does that matter? Right? That's what makes that important when the stuff that's really important, God, Satan, sin, how should we live? Why do we suffer? Why aren't we having tea with God anymore? Why are we remote from God? Why aren't we in Eden anymore? When these topics are what really matter. This is Milton's defense of his subject. He says that it's more heroic than any of that other stuff because it matters more. Me, of these, he's talking about war and knights, stories of knights and stuff. Of these, nor skilled nor studious, I'm not very good with all that material. Higher argument remains, sufficient of itself to raise that name, the name of heroic, unless an age too late, or cold climate, or years damp my intended wing depressed. And much they may, if all be mine, not hers who brings it nightly to my ear. He says, if I haven't gotten too old yet, because this is written at the end of Milton's life, if I haven't gotten too old, or if the cold weather that I live in hasn't made me too depressed, then I'll still be able to deliver this poem. But I'm not really delivering it all. The words aren't even mine. They're all coming from this divine source who brings them to me. And then he gets into the story. Satan takes on the form of the snake, and as with all of his previous, this is his final transformation. And when he transforms into the snake, he acknowledges that the snake's body, as he's made all of these transformations into lesser and lesser creatures all the way, those new bodies have infected his previous body, which was originally the sort of angelic fire that Raphael was talking about. And now it's been corrupted by flesh and all of these ugly things, these physical forms. And so Satan's body has been corrupted, just like he's mentally and spiritually corrupted, so that his body becomes an appropriate physical representation, not of a great, angelic, masterful being, but of this miserable creature who slithers on the ground and is low, that anybody could kill with a boot heel. There's a lot of discussion between Adam and Eve in this, in which they've been told, look, there's this bad guy out there, don't let your guard down. Raphael warned them. And Adam says, okay, well, let's get to work today. They've got a garden to tame. They know that they're going to have children, so children are coming. We're going to get more help here, but for the moment, there's just the two of us, so, you know, this is what we should do. And Eve wants to go off by herself. Now, your book, in the introduction, makes a big deal about Eve's independence. I think they're a little overplaying it. I don't see Eve's independence as portrayed in this book as a good thing. I think it's portrayed as a kind of willful disobedience, like whatever you want, I want the opposite. It's a kind of, Milton portrays women as being kind of flighty and sort of stubborn, and they want their way, and they want what you don't want, just to be contrary. There's a kind of contrarianness in Eve's argument. And she's really stubborn about it. She's like, what, don't you trust me? You know, and if you trusted me, then you would let me go off by myself, you know? And Adam sort of gets trapped. We have this sort of classic representation of the sort of henpecked husband, you know, kind of trapped by a woman's wiles. And so finally they have this not quite an argument. You know, he would say, well, I don't want to argue. And she would say, well, we're not arguing, you know? And they have this not an argument. And then he says, okay, fine. Just go. You want to go off by yourself? Go off by yourself. And so she does. And Satan is afraid of Adam. Made for valor, right? Remember. But he's not afraid of Eve. So he recognizes that she is vain. And so he plays on her vanity. He transforms into, he's already the serpent, so he gets close to her, and he makes himself beautiful for her because he knows that she has an eye for beauty. And he lies to her. He says, well, she says, well, how can you talk? I didn't think anything could talk. She's not the smartest tack in the tool shed, right? We've ascertained this already. She says, I didn't think anybody could talk. And he says, well, I couldn't until I ate this fruit from this tree, and then, wow, look at me. And I can show it. And she says, well, that sounds pretty cool. Show me. And he says, well, right this way. And he leads her to the tree, and she's like, oh, well, that's stupid. We wasted our time. We can't eat this. I can't eat this. And he says, but why? Well, God said we're going to die if we eat it. Serpent says, well, I'm not dead. I ate it. And let me tell you, it's awesome. It gives me knowledge, and I know so much now. And he tricks Eve into falling for that. She falls for this, and she decides that, well, it's all based on the idea that she thinks the serpent is telling the truth. She thinks, well, God didn't kill the serpent, so either he doesn't really mean it. God says, I'm going to kill you if you eat from the tree. Either he doesn't really mean it, or it only applies to us and not to animals, in which case animals are more important to him than we are, and that's sort of messed up. So she eats it. And then you have a very important, I thought this is a very interesting phrase, and you have a very interesting argument in your book. The note is note 4 on page 834, and it's referring to a section of lines where Eve has just eaten the fruit, and now she's trying to think, well, what am I going to do now? The note reads, in these crucial lines, Eve's thoughts are shown moving through 3 stages. First, the idea of not sharing her knowledge with Adam, so as to enhance her own power. Because now I'll be the boss, because I'll know things he doesn't know. With the gratuitous notion that lesser power brings no freedom at all. This is exactly Satan's problem, right? This whole idea of freedom is very problematic in this book, because God makes Adam free, but they're in the chain of being, and Adam serves God. Then jealousy at the thought of her own possible death, and Adam wedded to another Eve. Like, well, if I die, if God kills me, but he doesn't kill Adam, then Adam will marry somebody else, and Eve gets jealous over this. And Eve, finally, with an opportune resurgence of love, the resolve to be with Adam in bliss or woe. That is, that we should be together. Whatever happens, we should be together. And if that means that he is in sin with me, then he's in sin with me. Thus, this passage is essentially representative of Milton's characterization of Eve in her relation to Adam, and possibly of some of the poet's own conceptions of women in general. It's important to note that we don't know what Milton really thinks about women. We only know what his book says about women. Right? We can't read Milton's mind. Even if he were alive, we can't use the force on him. We can't read his mind. But we can read the book. And the book shows Eve is going through these sort of phases, where first she imagines being powerful, being in charge, and then she is consumed by jealousy, but finally she settles on love. Okay. So when I was doing the class, a live class, I asked my students, so how does Eve get Adam to eat the fruit? Someone said, well, she's a typical woman. She couldn't believe you said this. typical woman. She, like, guilt trips him into eating it or something. And I said, well, is that true? Let's look at it. The scene is on page 841, where Eve returns to him. And Adam's been out, making a wreath of flowers to give to Eve when she returns, like making her a present, And she comes back and she tells him what she's done. And he's horrified. I'm on the wrong page. It's on page 835. Thus Eve, with countenance blithe, her story told. But in her cheek distemper flushing glowed. She's blushing in shame. On the other, she doesn't sound like she talks a good game. She says, oh, it's great, it's fine, it's easy, there's no problem. But her face betrays that she's ashamed. On the other side, Adam, soon as he heard the fatal trespass done by Eve, amazed, astonished, stood, and blank, a horror chill ran through his veins, and all his joints relaxed. From his slack hand the garland wreathed for Eve down dropped, and all the faded roses shed. Speechless he stood and pale, till thus at length, first to himself, he inward silence broke. He's just horrified by what he's just heard, because he knows that God said, if you eat it, you're dead. Okay, so now what's he going to do? O fairest of creation, last and best of all God's works, creature in whom excelled whatever can to sight or thought be formed, holy, divine, good, amiable, or sweet. Those are all the characteristics of the feminine in Milton. Holy, divine, good, amiable, and sweet. How art thou lost? How on a sudden lost? Defaced, deflowered, and now to death devote. Oh, such a great line, right? Rather, how hast thou yielded to transgress the strict forbiddance, how to violate the sacred fruit forbidden? Some cursed fraud of enemy hath beguiled thee, yet unknown. Key line. And me with thee hath ruined. For with thee certain my resolution is to die. How can I live without thee? How forego thy sweet converse and love so dearly joined, to live again in these wild woods forlorn? Should God create another Eve, and I another rib afford? Yet loss of thee would never from my heart. No, no. I feel the link of nature draw me. Flesh of flesh, bone of my bone thou art, and from thy state mine never shall be parted, bliss or woe. She doesn't have to say a thing. She tells the whole story, and Adam's like, well, I guess we're both screwed, because I can't live without you. I love you. I can't live without you. If you were gone, I would feel you physically gone for the rest of my life. How can I go and live alone when I've known the time that we had together? So I guess whatever you did, I'll be there with you. She doesn't have to say anything. Adam chooses to follow her out of love. Well, remember we were just talking about how Raphael says that passion is bad, love is good, passion is bad. Well, as soon as they eat, they're overcome with passion. They recognize they have lust for the first time, and then afterwards they're ashamed and they're miserable. They have a fight. They argue. All of those things that their relationship begins to become imperfect, in the same sense that, you know, every relationship is imperfect. Everybody fights. Every couple fights. But until that moment, they hadn't. Well, the remainder of the book, books 10 and you have a little bit from 10 and a little bit from 12. God reveals his punishment to them, but more importantly, he reveals what's going to happen now. It illustrates some of the things we've previously been talking about, because Adam gets a vision with God of the future of mankind. He sees all of his descendants, all of the race of mankind, all the great things they build, and finally, and all the awful things they do, until finally this man comes who redeems all of the sin and saves the whole human race. And Adam's allowed to see this, and so he knows that it's all going to work out. It's going to work out okay. Notice that it's God and Adam that get this vision. Eve wakes up, and she's had a dream in which she saw all this stuff. But we don't get to see that dream, right? The accessibility of God is limited to the man in this book. Getting a dream is very passive, but Adam has a very sort of personal vision. Well, anyway. They both speak about how easy the punishment is, that living in the world isn't going to be so bad. You know, Eve says, yes, okay, I'm going to have pain whenever I give birth, but only when I give birth. And Adam says, yeah, I'm going to have to work for food now, but, you know, work is good. Work is physically empowering and rewarding. It feels good to work. And they accept their new fate, and they understand that the punishment they've been given is not actually cruel, that the punishment is merciful, and it's not so bad. All right, well, give it a shot. I hope that you found this useful as you were reading through, and I want to encourage you. After this class is over, you know, you're looking at your holiday break ahead of you, maybe. You know, you can find an entire copy of Paradise Lost online for free, or you can. It's public domain. You can buy Paradise Lost for 99 cents plus shipping from some used bookstore on Amazon.com. Now that you've tasted it, when you don't have a teacher breathing down your neck and you don't have an exam to do, think about getting back into it, because you have spent the last 3 months preparing yourselves to read this book. And you deserve to read the whole book, not just one part of it. Well, I hope that you found this useful. I'm going to let you guys go, and take care. Happy holidays.